Well, welcome everybody to book group 7. A really exciting one, actually. I've been very much looking forward to this one because it's on the subject of inclusion, equality, and diversity. And we've got two of my favorite chapters. Chapter 5 by Elizabeth Henderson and chapter 15 of Chade Tembo from the book Plays the Way. So we're going to start with Chade. I must first of all explain, Chade, if you got a first edition of the book, you didn't have a chapter 15. We were very fortunate that got taken to task for not having a chapter on diversity and equality, which I immediately began to feel deeply guilty about. As the book was selling so very well, we were going to constant reprints, so we were able to do a second edition. And I don't know whether he's here tonight, but I really must thank Jamel Kali Campbell, because he was someone that I met through Twitter and said, we really want a chapter on this topic, but I don't know anyone in Scotland that's working in this area, and it's got to be Scotland. And he said, well, go and have a look at a blog called Critical Early Years. And I did. And I thought, ooh, I think we've just found exactly this chap. And I must therefore also thank Chade, because he wrote the chapter over his Christmas holidays at a record rate, and it's brilliant. It's really useful addition, I think, to the literature, and particularly to the book, up to early years literature. So I'm going to introduce him first, and then Elizabeth. Chade Tembo is a lecturer at Perth College at the University of the Highlands and Islands, and he's also a postgraduate student at the moment in the University of the West of Scotland. But on top of that, he's a trustee for early education and co-convener of the Scottish Educational Research Association Early Years Network. And as I've already said, he writes independently at Critical Early Years. So Chade, can I hand over to you and you can do the screen sharing thing?
Absolutely, thank you for that, Sue. I'm just going to share my screen now. So good evening, everyone. It's really nice to see you all here today, or see your names on the screen and some familiar face names as well. I have to shout out Jamel Kali. Please do follow him on Twitter. He's a fantastic black male early years educator who's doing some really good practice at the moment. I'm not going to introduce myself again, just to say that my name is Chade, and I'm an early years practitioner. As Sue said, I lecture at Perth College and I'm a PhD student at the University of the West of Scotland. The focus of this presentation today is really just to spend 10 to 15 minutes going over this notion of innocent and political childhoods. So I'm going to spend the first part of the session talking about that, and then I'll move on to looking at claims and realities, and then I'll sum up and provide you with some reflections towards the end. It touches on some themes that I do address within my chapter, but those of you who have read it will note that it's quite varied, the things I talk about. So I'm really just going to give you a general overview of my intentions for the chapter and the underpinnings and the political nature of the chapter. And then hopefully that'll set us up for some nice questions and discussions afterwards. I think it's going to flow really nicely with Elizabeth's presentation afterwards. Sharing my slides is fine. Feel free to take photos. All my sources at the bottom of my slides. I'm really happy to send my slides for those of you who would like to look at them afterwards. So I want to start with a quote from Glenda McNaughton's book, and it's Two Early Years Practitioners in Conversation. Glenda McNaughton's book, Rethinking Gender in Early Childhood Education, was published 20 years ago, although the first time I read it was probably a few years back, and it really resonated with my experience as a former early years practitioner. So I'll just read it out to you. Juan says to Penelope, I'm really looking forward to reading that new gender diverse storybook to the preschool children. I wonder how they will react to it. Penelope says, don't you think that children in your group are a little too young to cope with it? Joanne says, I don't think so. I think gender is already affecting their play decisions. I think Joanne says a very reasonable answer there. However, Penelope says, I think it's in your head, not theirs. I just don't think that gender matters to young children. You should let them keep their innocence while they can. You'll be planting ideas in their head that they are not ready for. I really resonated with this quote when I first read it because it's very similar to my own experience as a practitioner working in Bristol, trying to get that new gender diverse storybook onto the shelves and being faced with some comments from practitioners that children should keep their innocence as long as possible. Of course, I think this is really important that we push back against these notions. They're very idealized and romanticized ideas about innocent childhoods that we need to be challenging as much as possible. I think we still see this today when we look at our perceptions of childhood as a whole. Childhood continues to be seen as this time of presumed innocence in many ways. It's often located outside of the real world, as if childhood itself isn't a real world for the children. Childhood is often seen as a kind of natural time untouched by the adult world to come. We often see that childhood is contrasted to culture or cultural worlds. I think it's really important that we notice this. The logic often follows that children are being exposed too much too soon. For me, it's really, really important that we push back against this notion of innocent childhoods, the idea that childhood is kind of romanticized and idealized. Although we still see it today, I want to share with you an example from the recent Birth to 5 Matters guidance within the English context, just to illustrate how this notion of childhood innocence continues to be perpetuated in recent times. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Birth to 5 Matters, this was an alternative piece of guidance published in England by the Early Years Coalition in response to the official reforms that were taking place by the Department for Education and the new revisions to the Early Years Foundation stage. Essentially, the Birth to 5 Matters guidance was built on the premise that not enough was being done to build a curriculum that reflected the needs of the child in the 21st century. So we really felt the need to include a section on equalities and inclusion and anti-racist pedagogy and looking at equalities in the early years. But the reception to the publication of the guidance has been really, really interesting. This headline here, that nursery teachers should be taught to give lessons on white privilege, says guidance, was published in the Sunday Telegraph over the Easter weekend. Firstly, that's not true. We're not asking teachers to give lessons on white privilege because we don't give lessons in the early years. We're simply asking practitioners to reflect on their own identities and look at how that can affect their practice with young children. I think the quote, though, from Robert Halford MP, who is the chair of the House of Commons Education Select Committee, was really, really interesting. I just want to break this down a little bit. He said that this is just unacceptable. This dogma and doctrine is totally out of place. The whole purpose of children learning is to learn, not for some kind of political Soviet indoctrination session. I think this is a really interesting quote for a number of reasons. Dogma and doctrine, they're very common accusations that have been levelled at teachers who are interested in social work, justice work over recent years. It's something we've seen levelled at university lecturers. It's something we've seen levelled at primary school teachers. So I'm really unsurprised to see that it's being used against early years practitioners. It's a very common right-wing tactic. That's not what I want to focus on. It's the second part of this quote, where Robert Halford says that the whole purpose of children learning is to learn, not for some kind of political Soviet indoctrination session. A quick analysis here shows you a very subtle sleight of hand in separating learning from politics, as if the whole purpose of children learning is to learn, not for some kind of political Soviet indoctrination session. I think that overlooks a really subtle but really important fact that anyone who's done the research on childhood will know that political motivations are already embedded into the foundations of many learning practices. In fact, to position learning as somehow neutral, as separate from politics, for me that masks a motivation in itself to maintain the status quo and not engage with social justice work in the early years. When we look at the overlapping histories of early childhood from the 70s onwards, as they became entangled with processes of neoliberalism and the expansion of capitalism, it's entirely clear that politics are already in the nursery. So this notion of innocent childhoods just doesn't stand up. In the contemporary moment, when we look at the neoliberal political influences on learning, mechanisms such as testing, inspection, monitoring, audits, measurement, comparative league tables, you'll all be familiar with these terms. And I think they're really important that we notice them as part of the increasing businessification of early childhood and the kind of creeping influence of neoliberal thought in educational spaces. Specifically within the early years, we have increasing measurement of children's developmental progress according to ages and stages, which continue to value the child according to very normative models of development. I think in doing so, they create a particular kind of subjectivity that's tailored to meet the needs of the marketplace in later life. I think it's really problematic, and we need to be challenging this. The Scottish government's implementation of SNSA testing for 7-year-olds in 2015 is particularly reflective of this trend. I think we need to maintain an understanding, therefore, of childhood as thoroughly political, where the early years from birth serve as a really important site for the socialization of people within our society. This means a multitude of things, but I'm just going to focus on a few here. For me, as a researcher, it means recognizing that concepts such as neoliberalism, gender binary, heteronormativity, whiteness, neurotypicality, and ableism are not abstract issues. It's not abstract to talk about gender or LGBT inclusion in early years. Actually, they're crucial in allowing us to understand how certain childhoods are constructed at the expense of others. For me, that also means recognizing that inequalities are not only an issue in formal schooling, where we have the statistics to prove inequality. Actually, they're already happening in our nursery environments. Politics are already taking place in our nursery settings. And finally, the point I just want to focus on here is that we need to hold governments to account and be really critical of certain claims. Of course, the Scottish government's claim that they've been claiming for the past 8 years now is that we want Scotland to be the best place in the world to grow up, and that means ensuring every child has an equal chance to succeed. Now, this claim is dotted throughout various policy documents. It's in their place strategy and in various other areas, but we need to be holding it into account because it's been 8 years now since this claim was first put forward. Is it the best place in the world for LGBT plus children? I'm not so sure, especially when we look at the statistics. In schools, 71% of LGBT young people experienced bullying on the grounds of being LGBT in 2017. This is actually a rise from 69% in 2012 and 60% in 2007. We're also seeing hate crime in Scotland rising, with reports of prejudice relating to sexual orientation. This is a consistent increase since the statistics were introduced in 2010, 2011, with the exception of 1 year. I think there's also the protests that we've seen in the past 2 years. Those of you who have been following, or perhaps not, the implementation of the No Outsiders programme, which is primarily in the English context, and it relates to the inclusion of LGBT inclusive teaching within schools. But there have been some real backlash against the implementation of these materials within the English context. And more recently, we've seen the news with the Catholic schools in the Highlands and their decision not to implement the LGBT inclusive education in their schools. I think all of these kind of claims suggest that at the moment, the best place in the world for children to grow up, it's not the best place in the world for LGBT plus children. I certainly don't think it's the best place in the world for Black and minoritized children either. I think in the past year, we've really had a light shed on incidents of racial discrimination and bullying and prejudice within schools. The report that I've got there on the right for you shows that more than 2,000 incidents, racist incidents, have been recorded in Scottish schools in recent years. Campaigners have warned that this is the tip of the iceberg. I know that's true because I've been in school as a Black student, and I know how many racist incidents do not go reported. I think you can all think back to your schooling experiences and think about how much does not get reported officially. So that for me is really, really problematic, and we need to be aware of racial prejudice and discrimination. Scotland is currently not the best place in the world for Black and minoritized children. I think there's also this perception that in Scotland, we're all right here because we're all white here. I think that's not true for a start, and it's a very narrow form of nationalism that we really need to be pushing back for if we really care about the experience of minoritized children in Scotland. I'll just sum up then that the Scottish government's claim for Scotland to be the best place in the world for children to grow up, it's currently not matching the reality, and it hasn't been doing so for a while. There is much more work that we need to be doing to centre equalities within the Scottish context. There's no easy answer to this, but one thing I will just comment on is that we shouldn't be pining over the Nordic countries. And this is a bit of a bugbear of mine because I've been to too many conferences, too many events on equalities or neoliberalism, where the answer always ends up being, well, why don't we see what countries in Northern Europe are doing? And that for me constitutes a form of cruel optimism. Cruel optimism is a concept by Lauren Balan. It's a fantastic book that doesn't really relate to the early years at all, but I'd recommend it. And she says that a relation of cruel optimism exists when an obstacle, something that we desire, is actually an obstacle to our flourishing. And for me, that captures the sentiment of looking over to the Nordic countries and that perception that the grass is always greener. Actually, when you look at the statistics, the Nordic countries have quite significant issues with xenophobia and anti-immigration rhetoric. The truth is that no country is free from the issues we face here, and we should be looking at a very different, diverse cultural context in which Scotland is situated compared to the Nordic countries. As I am coming to the end of my talk now, I'm just going to leave you with some reflection points before I hand back over to Sue. I just want you to think about how you might be challenging that narrative of childhood innocence in your practice. How are you keeping childhood political? And there are a number of different ways you can do this. I'm not going to speak on all of these now, but in what ways are you encouraging representation in your resources? In what ways are you pushing that gender diverse storybook that Joanne was talking about at the start? How are you becoming anti-racist in your pedagogy? The last year has seen a real increase in interest in anti-racist provision. We're now not short on resources. So it's all about action and what you should be doing to engage anti-racism actively in your pedagogy. Challenging stereotypes around gender, looking at those inclusive materials. Gender stereotypes and unconscious gender bias is now noted within Realising the Ambition. So that for me is a really positive step. Promoting diversity among the profession, there's mechanisms of testing, engaging with your wider community and raising the standards of the profession. All of these things for me are ways in which we can keep childhood political. Make sure that we're pushing equalities on the agenda as much as possible. So we'll just leave you those reflection points and perhaps we can pick up on one or two of those in the discussion after Elizabeth's session, I will say. Thank you for listening and hand back over to Sue.
Made it. Sorry, everyone. Thank you ever so much, Shadow. That started us off, crikey. And that horrible quote from the chair of the House of Commons, I made my blood boil. It's awful. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very, very much indeed. And we now move to Elizabeth, who I know pretty well, actually, so it's very difficult to sort of introduce you because there's so much more I know than what I've got written down here. 40 years of experience in education and care, covering the whole sector from nursery through to universities. I'm currently working for a Scottish local authority supporting early learning and care professionals and building a community of practice in outdoor ELC. Also the author of, I have to take a deep breath before saying this title, Author of Ethnography and Early Childhood Education and Care, Narrating the Heart of the Practice, which I wish it was just called Narrating the Heart of the Practice, Elizabeth, because it's a wonderful book. And a mum and a granny. New grandchildren, twins born last week, so that's baby. She's looking very bright considering. Thank you very much. Can I pass over now to you to do screen sharing bit?
Okay, so just give me a thumbs up, Sue, if that's okay. You can just see the slides.
Excellent. Yeah, fine.
So good evening, everybody, and thanks very much to Shadi for a rip-roaring start there. Wow, there's a lot to think about. I'm going to take a very different approach. I'm going to talk about inclusion in general, and then I'm going to look a little bit at additional support needs. So let's just think about how the Scottish Government define an inclusive approach. I'll just give you a moment to read that. It's interesting they use the word cornerstone. That's a very important part of a building, isn't it? Because it defines the shape of the building. And they see this as a cornerstone to achieving equity and excellence in education for all our children and young people. So I want to start by just looking for a moment at the context in which we're going to deliver this inclusive approach. Poverty plays a very big part in our society at the moment. With 1 in 4 children in Scotland living in poverty, we expect that to rise to about 29% by 2023, which is between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3. So this is definitely going in the wrong direction. We also know that poverty is corrosive, and children who live in poverty are 2.5 times more likely to struggle with chronic illness and 3 times more likely to experience mental health problems. With additional support needs, currently, well, in 2018, that stood at 30.9%, so that's almost 1/3 of our children, and I would anticipate that's been exacerbated by COVID-19. When we ask what are additional support needs, the Scottish Government has a very broad definition, and I've just put a few of those on the screen for you to read. I think we can say, looking at just poverty and additional support needs, that this is not a minority of our children anymore. This is a huge and deeply worrying problem. And I'd also like to add that the UK government spend 2.9 billion, that's a billion and not a million, per year in policy interventions, long-term losses to the economy, lower educational attainment, poor mental health, and chronic health. That is a lot of money. It might be better that they put that money to not rescuing children who've fallen in the river, but walking up the river to find out why they fell in the first place. So when I grew up in the age of the dinosaurs, most people in my family lived in the same town. So Auntie May and Uncle Joe lived up the road. Uncle Jack and Auntie Mary lived down the road. My granny lived 10 streets away. Her friend, her best friend, lived 2 streets away. So family ties were very close. I knew all my neighbours. I knew them all by name. And some of them had the names of colours. So I used to like reciting everybody's names, the browns, the blacks, the greens, the whites, and so on. But they also knew us. So when we were out playing, if Mrs. Milady knew that we were up to mischief, she'd come out and she'd say, I'm going to tell your mum what you're up to. And you knew that the whole community had their eyes on you, but you were known and you were seen. Most people belonged to a church in some form or another, maybe didn't go very regularly, but family, local community and church certainly defined our identity and our makeup. And now that's no longer the case. And we can say that that's great because it means we've got more freedom, but it also means we're more exposed. And so today's children might have a sense of homelessness if they don't know their neighbours, if they don't belong to a community of some sort or other, and if they're just at home and their family, their extended family is elsewhere, they may feel a sense of homelessness and a lack of belonging. So when they come to nursery, that may be the first time that they've experienced something outside, and they will be looking for a sense of belonging to that community and building their sense of identity. So we have a huge task on our hand to help them build a very positive sense of identity in our ELC settings. So you might ask, well, is it important to be seen, to be heard, and to be known? Yes, it is. Woodhead and Brooker talk about belonging as the psychosocial glue that locates every individual and connects people to each other. And I'm sure COVID-19 has made it absolutely clear that all our networks, our family, our friends, our colleagues really help us to have a sense of belonging and a sense of well-being and a sense of identity, because a lot of that was taken away during lockdown. And a lot of people consequently suffered feelings of isolation and depression and mental health problems. So belonging really is something that's very critical to our well-being. If we belong somewhere, we have a reflection of ourselves given back to us by those around us. And that helps us to understand our lives, because we dealt this understanding in relationship. It's relational. We also have a feeling that our lives have meaning and purpose. You know, I'm 3 years old, I'm called Mary, I go to the local nursery, my key worker is called Tom, and I love playing with Fiona and Lucy. We develop a sense of meaning and purpose and identity. And if we have that strong sense of self, it gives us something with which to meet life's challenges. But Aaron Antonovsky, in his theory of coherence, says if we don't have these things, it's very easy to feel that we're overwhelmed by life and we simply cannot cope. And he also says that the noise in society these days, so that's just everything that comes at us from every tablet you own and in the newspapers and so on, the radio and the TV, that the noise is so loud that people are struggling to maintain their own identity. And this is an issue. So I want to ask, what do inclusive policies ask of us in ELC within the context that I've just shared? Nutbrand says, because inclusive policies are in fact only realised in acts of inclusive practices, what happens and how children are enabled to belong is crucial. So we can actually say that policies are nothing without the practitioners to deliver those policies. However, Nutbrand and Clough say inclusion is a social and political struggle where individual identity and difference has prominence. In the early years, achieving inclusive settings means change for the entire setting and all practitioners who work there. So my question is, are all practitioners prepared for this social and political struggle? And the answer is no, because in a document from last year, Additional Support for Learning All Our Children, the government have recognised that a large number of practitioners actually do not subscribe to the inclusion agenda. And this is problematic. So our relationship with our children emerges from who we are. So we have to be very mindful of our personal values and how these values become manifest in our practice. How well do we know ourselves? So my first question is, what lens do you employ when looking and listening to our children? Do you see them as vulnerable? Do you see them as strong? Are you challenged by some of these children? Then how can we respond in ways that empower our children? Are you able to empower the children that you could get along with well, but maybe not so able to empower the children that you struggle with? Do we treat children and their families equitably? Or are there some families that we're happy to rub shoulders with and other families that we want to give a wide berth to, and we interact very little with them? And bear in mind that in our early years settings, this is where we have the most contact every day with our families. So how do we treat our families? Do we include them? And my last question is, can we be honest in our reflective practices with ourselves about our need to change? Because when we reflect, we need to be asking, how can I grow? How can I develop? How can I change? Parker Palmer suggests that good educational practice requires self-knowledge, and he calls this a secret hidden in plain sight. So looking at these 4 children, do you have a different visceral reaction to each of them? Are you drawn to working with some of them more than others? Are you aware of this? Are you aware of being affected by children in a visceral way? And are you prepared in your reflective practice to consider your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions towards all the children that you meet? And I would have to say that a long time ago, I had an issue with what academics now call leaky bodies. So this is bodies and fluids, bodies that suppurate. And I used to struggle with children who drooled and who had wide open mouths, because often they had bad breath as well. And what I didn't know initially was that I struggled with the touching of the drool on children's mouths, and I often would flinch and look away and then draw breath and start again. So in my reflective practice, I suddenly realized one day that that's what I'd been doing. So I said to myself, how do you think it feels to be the child who sees you do that? Because that means that you're not respecting that child, and that looks like rejection. What are you going to do about it? So I had to take myself to task on the leaky body issue, and I worked out a few skills: more perfume, rosemary oil dabbed on my clothes, because rosemary oil in my experience masks just about anything, and also thick tissues that wouldn't then break in my hand, so that when I wiped a child's face, I wasn't covered in drool, and that made it easier for me. I'm not proud of that. I'm ashamed of what my behaviour was, if I'm being very honest. I'm quite ashamed of it. But at least in my reflective practice, I was brutally honest with myself, and I knew I had to change. So I'm asking you, are you prepared to change? And are you prepared to challenge yourself, both in your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions? So how well are we doing in Scotland with inclusion? So here's the 2017 ELC inspection summary for Health and Social Care Standard 3.1, ensuring well-being, equality and inclusion. And you'll see that only 1% of settings achieved excellence, 28% very good, and 45% good. But if you look below to 2018-19, nobody achieved excellence, 17% very good, so that's down by 11%, and 52 good. So I think we can safely say that there's slippage there. Now, I'm not somebody who is into data-driven practices. Anybody that knows me knows that. However, when you have got quantitative data, I think it's good to be able to look at it and then ask the right questions. What's happening here? What are the challenges? How can we help this to be better? Not how can we be punitive and call people out and name and shame, but how can we help, and how can we help this to be a better practice, because we're letting down families and their children. So I think one of the things that gets in the way of delivering the best practice is this: mercantile logic undermines the ethical logic of relationship-based practices. This is due to the former's emphasis on effectivity and the latter's emphasis on responsibility. So what we have here is a clash of paradigms: business versus ethics, data-driven practices versus child-centered practices. And the people who shoulder this dissonance, if you like, are the ELC workforce and the children and their families. So if, like me, you're a holistic practitioner, and I've tried to be since 1979, maybe you subscribe to multiple intelligences of Gardner and Goleman, or 100 languages of Reggio Emilia, or Kerry Opie's notion that, like the Totoki tree, autistic people bloom in their own time and space. And I really love this concept, but I think it should be rolled out for all children, not just children on the autism spectrum, that all children should be given the time and space in which to bloom. But if you subscribe to holistic practices, how do you deal with that whilst living in a world that really, or living in a society in which the business model weighs heavily on the ethics model, and the data-driven practices often outweigh the practices of our responsibilities to our children, because this is really an enormous pressure under which to work. And so I want to address the elephant in the room. As Jane Osgood said, ELC practitioners are often hailed as the saviour of the nation. We are going to close the poverty gap, close the attainment gap. We're going to deliver inclusive practices. We are effectively the all-singing, all-dancing ELC workforce with a magic wand in our pockets. And this is actually not true. We're also working under the historic conflation of mothering and childcare. So our service is really poorly understood. In fact, I would say it's grossly misunderstood. And we're not given the kudos that we should have. And we're certainly not understood in a way that's helpful to us and the work that we do. And so this means that the contexts in which we are working are certainly not neutral. They are inflected with the values of society and all of the government guidelines. Within the education sector itself, we're marginalised. So I was speaking to somebody a few weeks ago who told me that she was writing her nursery reports, and she said, I love doing this, but I also think it's a waste of time. So I said, why is it a waste of time? She said, because when the children go into P1, Mrs. Richardson opens a drawer on her desk and throws them all in and says, I don't need to read these because they've just been playing, and learning starts in P1. Now, I found that really alarming, because I've heard that for years and years and years, and this still hasn't gone away. So within the education sector itself, we are not understood. There's also a huge pay differential between what people in early years are paid and people in education are paid. In fact, if you go and work for the Royal Mail or you become a janitor, you're likely to get paid more. The Scottish Government know, because they've said with additional support for learning all our children, that there's an over-dependency on committed individuals to carry everything through, and that's just not acceptable. We're still expected to meet targets and outcomes. So are we going to be demonised when we can't do this, when our practice itself is being challenged? And we're also asked to be reflective, critical, porous, vulnerable, engage with uncertainty, and be responsive. Oops, sorry. So what does working with inclusion mean for practitioners, and what might that feel like? Well, we have to work with uncertainty because relational practices demand that. We don't quite know where things are going to go. When you engage in sustained shared thinking with a child, you don't quite know where you're going because you're in the child's world and they're leading. And some people might find living with that uncertainty quite demanding. Can we risk being open and vulnerable and porous? Some people might find that quite demanding, not being in control. Are we willing to be affected by the other? Often when we talk about relational practices, we talk about the adult observing the child and responding to the child and helping to move the child forward in their learning and development. What we don't do is look at the child and the impact of the child on the adult. But if we just go back to my example of leaky bodies, the child that actually I was working with, that child taught me enormous lessons about myself. And I went on to absolutely love this child and learn such a lot from this child. I feel so grateful. But are we willing? Are we always willing to be affected by the other? Or does that leave you feeling threatened? Can we dare to become better human beings? And Plato said the highest form of knowledge is empathy, for it requires us to suspend our egos and live in another's world. So all of this is being asked of a workforce that's grossly misunderstood and underpaid. So what do we need to do now? Well, we need to hold the government to account on the recommendations in support for learning all our children and their potential. And one of their recommendations is that they want to ensure all teachers hold and enact professional values of inclusion and inclusive practice and see this as a core part of their role. Well, let's be sure that we hold them to that, please. We need to remain critical in our thinking at all times and reflective in our practices. We need to challenge the dominant discourse that's based on business models and mercantile logic. It does not sit comfortably with what we're trying to do. It does not belong there. It's a complete mismatch. We need to ensure that ASL becomes more visible because it's not. It's often seen as an add-on. And in fact, some people who were interviewed for the All Our Children document said they didn't really think it was their job to work with children who had special needs of any kind, which is quite startling. And we need to challenge the key barriers identified by the government, which are risk aversion in our settings, a blame culture, and a drive to hit targets. But we also need to listen to our children and support the workforce. And the children are telling us themselves they want meaningful relationships, they want staff who are better informed, and they say, please don't define me by my label. So I want to leave you with just a couple of quotes as provocations, one by the author of The Little Prince. He who is different from me does not impoverish me, he enriches me. And Parker Palmer, we came into our professional roles for reasons of the heart, animated by a passion for helping people to learn. How do we stay close to the passion and commitment that took us into this work? Research indicates the majority of early years professionals do enter the workforce because they passionately want to make a difference to the children in their care, and they are passionate about their work. But how do we remain committed to that so we avoid burnout? I'm going to leave you to read this last provocation by Paulo Freire, who's been one of my heroes since the 1970s. And the last line, it must generate other acts of freedom. Otherwise, it is not love. I think love is grossly misunderstood. So I'm just going to finish with a little line from T.S. Eliot in 4 quartets. Love is a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And the references, and then back to Sue.
Thank you very much. And I'm still reeling, actually. I just don't know where to start in terms of discussion. I wonder, many practitioners do not subscribe to the inclusion agenda, Elizabeth said. I didn't catch exactly which document that was from, Elizabeth. Can you unmute? And
yeah. So that's last year's document, Additional Support for Learning, All Our Children and All Their Potential. So the government have identified it themselves. And I think it's on the same page. They say that, yes, a lot of people don't subscribe to the inclusion agenda because they feel it's just not their job. I don't know what they think their job is, but that's another question. But then they go on to say, and we realise that that the people delivering this agenda are the ones who are fully committed and passionate about their jobs, but this is not okay. I have no idea how in the recommendation they're going to ensure that everybody they employ subscribes to inclusive practices. How are they going to do that? I don't know.
Yeah, right. Well, let's throw it to Shada. Are there any points arising from what Elizabeth was saying there that you immediately would like to pick up on?
Yeah, that was so interesting, Elizabeth. I mean, the status of the profession is a massive issue, and it does relate to equalities. I think about every single gender diversity training I've done, and for most practitioners, this is the first time they've ever heard of this sort of stuff. So inclusion and equality just isn't on the agenda in many courses, or if it is, it's in the second and third years, and it might be a bit of an optional course. This needs to be fundamental to early years provision as much as possible. I think back to my own experience around the men in early years arguments. You know, this was something I had to find out for myself in the third year of my dissertation. I didn't really know that I was different or why I was different when I was in my practice. And certainly we weren't having these conversations about gender in the nurseries. So for me, it's really, really important that we hold the Scottish Government to account and ensure that they can make inclusion and equality fundamental to the role that early years practitioners have in supporting young children. I'm just thinking of that quote from Elizabeth, that practitioners didn't feel it was their role to support children with additional support needs. No. It speaks for itself, doesn't it? You don't need to say much more. Yeah.
Kate, are there any questions that have been coming through during or specific comments?
People are loving it, but just about the data, did the Kathy McCulloch wanted to know, did the framework, oh no, somebody else did the framework change between those years? Were the measures consistent? And Kathy asked, what do we base inspections on? Who decides what good levels of well-being, equity and inclusion are? Yeah.
Does anyone know?
Well, Elizabeth will.
I don't know if the criteria changed or not, but I used it simply because I think often we are hit over the head by data and held to account and named and shamed. And I think when we've got data like that, it's just important to say, what are the issues going on here and what are the barriers that we can work on to take this away? The data is actually, if I'm right in saying, it's actually at the back, it's something like page 127 on the additional support for learning document, in the main document, not the executive summary. So I don't know if the criteria changed, my apologies about that, but I find it worrying, but I also just in general find it worrying that even in the 2017-18, only 1% got excellent. And I think, yeah, I think it goes back to the whole thing of the early years workforce being misunderstood, and we often don't have protected time for team meetings, and we don't have protected time for reflective practice and so on, yet we ask people to do that. So there's this huge disconnect between intention and practice. And the other day I was thinking about it, that, you know, when you go on street and you protest, people shout, what do you want? And you answer, I don't know, whatever it is, everything. When do you want it? Last week. But what they don't shout when they're out is, who's going to do it? And how are they going to do it? We don't ask that, you know, and you need to ask that. Otherwise, this is all in the clouds. So the reason I put the elephant on is because we have a lot of these wonderful intentions in early years, and rightly so, but we need to not just shout, what do we want and when do we want it? We need to say, well, actually, who's doing this? How are they going to do it? How can we support these people to do this? How can we get out of this complete gross misunderstanding of our sector? How can we give it the kudos that it deserves? Because it's a powerful place in which to be with children. It's the beginning of their building of their life's narratives within an institution. Now, if we don't get this right with the expansion, we could end up with a hugely institutionalized childhood. That gives me nightmares.
I suspect we already have a hugely institutionalized childhood in many respects. I found myself thinking when Shadow was talking about the innocent versus the political, the innocent childhood versus the political childhood. I think it was what made me so angry with the quote about the Soviet indoctrination stuff. Our children are indoctrinated from birth by marketers. I mean, constantly indoctrinated with all sorts of messages in all sorts of ways from the moment they're born. And yet, having worked on 3 government in England, government documents and various committees about the commercialization of childhood, none of them would lift a finger to stop it. You know, everybody's got to do other things rather than rein the market in. And of course, we had the education, again in England, they had the 1988 Education Act, which was basically about trying to make education more like the market and turn parents into consumers, which was when, you know, the whole business of the accountability and datafication thing started. So it's never been innocent in early years. It's always been people pushing things on children. And I think the difference between what Shadai's talking about in terms of being political is you're not saying teach the children specific things, tell them things. You're saying think about what you're like and how you react to their being me. Is that right? Am I right, Shadows?
Yeah, of course. I mean, for me, it's social justice in the widest possible sense, which starts in the early years, and that for me is really, really important. You know, whether or not the government are ever going to be on board with that is an entirely different question. I think the influence of market logic into early childhood is fairly entrenched now, and that's quite disappointing to see. I think what we are seeing now, maybe in the past year, especially with the rise of Zoom conferences, there's a lot of activism within the early years, and a lot of really good events happening in early childhoods, you know, specifically around anti-racism, for example. I know Liz Pemberton's doing some really good work on the Black Nursery Manager. So we are seeing a good level of activism. I think Nathan Archer's written about that as well. With regards to settings who are doing their own things, basically, you know, still working within the confines of the curriculum, but also going against that. And I think a good example of that would, of course, be Birth to 5 Matters, as a response to the official reforms put forward, because there is a real need now for a curriculum that meets the needs of the child in the 21st century, that is explicitly anti-racist, that challenges or promotes gender diversity, you know, pushes equality in the widest sense. So for me, that's really exciting to see in terms of the early years profession.
Do you think, realizing, I mean, I know you've been involved in Birth to 5 Matters, but realizing that ambition actually from Upstart's point of view has an advantage in that it actually goes through the whole of early level and is much more covering what I would call a kindergarten stage. So it was written before the Black Lives Matter movement really got underway. Do you think it fulfills the need, or is there more?
Realizing the ambition, or
realizing the ambition.
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure it does, because there isn't really anything related to race or racism in Realizing the Ambition. I don't think that's controversial to say. I think if you look at the document, there isn't really enough relating to that. There may be 1 or 2 comments relating to diversity or difference, but for me, if it's not explicit, practitioners won't get it. And I think we need to be naming anti-racism as much as possible. So for me, it was really exciting to see the work of the Anti-Racist Early Years Collective, who did the event recently. I think that's going to be really exciting. I know Cara Blaisdell is doing a project on the experiences of Black children during COVID. So there's, you know, research emerging in recent months and years that's looking at anti-racism in the Scottish context, building on the wider work of the SAME network, which is the Scottish Association of Minority Educators in Education. So looking at minoritized experiences of teachers in wider education, I think that's filtering down to the early years as well now. You know, from my own perspective, the CERA Early Years Conference in January, we had Liz Pemberton and we had Jamal Campbell as well. So that was really, really well attended, and that was really exciting to see. I think there's a real appetite for anti-racist teaching and an explicit engagement with those terms in early years.
Elizabeth, you and Realizing the Ambition, do you feel that it was adequate on the inclusion agenda?
I think it's a big step forward from all the other documents that have come before it, and I absolutely welcome it. But I think there's a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding in general of what inclusion really means and how we meet children and relational practices. And I think we really need to dig down on that, on all of the training courses, because this is a very profound thing. I mean, that quote by Plato saying the highest form of knowledge is empathy. Well, what are we doing when we're in relational practices? We're empathizing and entering that world of the other. So this is a very high order function. And we probably don't come to that naturally, most of us, and need to learn a lot about this on courses. But these are often the things that are not covered. It's often the more pragmatic things that are covered, and not these that involve your feelings and your thoughts and your actions. So I think we've got a long way to go. But I see inclusion on one level as being very simple. It's how I meet every single child with respect and dignity, irrespective of who they are, where they've come from, what they look like and what their need is. For me, that's just the bottom line. And that's also how I work. And as I've said to you before, Sue, you know, I was struggling with a child one day. This is donkeys years ago now. And I was banging my head off the wall thinking, I just cannot get a handle on this child. I don't understand this child. And then I said to myself, well, what do I need to know? Okay, so I then came up with 3 little touchstones. So my first question to myself about the child is, who are you? What gifts have you brought with you into the world? And how can I help you be the best that you can be? And just by holding fast to those things on days that were challenging, I felt I could still really be with any child in front of me with respect and dignity. So I think inclusion begins there. It belongs to every child. But I don't think it's well taught.
If inclusion begins there, Shadow, where does diversity and equality come within that inclusion bracket? Because it's all these nice abstract words we've got. How do we, what's the...
Yeah, good question. I mean, for me, inclusion is fundamentally a question of power and equality in that sense. And it's not something that's easy to map, often with statistics. And you know, that's why I say it's difficult to measure in the early years. But anyone who's worked in the early years as a practitioner will kind of feel the way that children engage with each other and their peers. Especially, I've worked in settings that are primarily quite middle class and white settings where there's 1 or 2 minoritized children, how they're treated in relation to their peers. For me, they're the issues of inclusion and how certain children are included at the expense of others, and more broadly, how certain childhoods are constructed at the expense of others. You know, when we maintain this vision of innocent childhoods, who gets left out and who isn't, you know, included in that notion of innocence? You know, more specifically, that's often Black children and Black boys and girls. And then when we look at the statistics and race and racism in later schooling environments, that's when it becomes clear that, you know, inclusion is related to power inequality in the earliest environments. And even when we think about additional support needs, you know, when we look later down the line, I think something like 50% of prisoners have some form of learning need. I think that was mentioned at the hustings recently. So, you know, these aren't abstract issues. They're fundamental to how we perceive equality in wider society. Inclusion's for me, is one way of you know, engaging equality. It's absolutely important that we do that as much as possible. Yeah.
There are also needs, though, that go unnoticed. And I'm thinking here, because of the way we've developed our education system, it overprivileges cognition. So those children who are artistic, who work in pictures, or who are good with their hands at crafts and so on, they are marginalized by the nature of the system itself. And that really pains me, because if you're a holistic practitioner, you want to develop head, heart and hands equally. It's not one before the other or one instead of the other. It's all of these things. That's what holistic practice is. And that's what's difficult to do when under pressure of time to meet targets and outcomes. And under pressure of time, if you're short-staffed or whatever, and that pains me, because that's what I think leads to the burnout. If you're a holistic practitioner, it's that feeling that you can't achieve the quality and the depth that you want with your children, that you know they rightly deserve, but the system can stop you from doing that. So I think we need a real change of mindset to acknowledge the 100 languages of children, and to acknowledge head, heart and hands, and to ensure that we are supported in doing that.
And to recognize that empathy is absolutely central to any sort of inclusive practice, any practice that is really concerned about letting children helping children, being there with children who are just being me. I keep holding on to that subtitle of Realizing the Ambition throughout this whole thing. I've been writing being me down over and over again. We've not talked much about gender, and I think it's another one of the areas that people do have a lot of problems about. So can I ask, Sade, would you like to sort of say your piece on the whole gender issue in nursery?
Yeah, I can say a few words on that. I mean, my approach really around gender is a gender diversity approach. I think what we've seen in recent years is a number of really good documents published in the Scottish early years field, improving gender balance. We've had the Scottish Care Inspectorate guidance, the zero tolerance guidance as well, I believe, maybe the same thing. And it's also noted within Realizing the Ambition. I think my issue with some of those terms is the language. And so for me, I use diversity. I promote gender diversity because for me, that's really important insofar as it goes beyond the binary that we often talk about with gender and just a man and a woman. It's much more diverse than that. And when we talk about gender balance, ultimately, if you look at the etymological term of that, it's derived from bi, and it's ultimately maintained on two. So gender balance doesn't really go far enough in promoting diversity for me. We also have approaches like gender neutrality, which I think are fine in recognizing that certain effects of gender can be dangerous, but we need to embrace the child and not neutralize their identities. So neutrality doesn't really cut it for me either, which is why I really like looking at diversity and promoting that with young children. But also with the profession, a really good example that I talk about in the book is working with more men of all kinds. Often when we see the men in early years argument, it's, men are good because they love rough and tumble, they love outdoor play. And I think we've seen a little bit of that in some of the promotional materials put out by the Scottish government in recent years. But actually, that's not all true. I wasn't an outdoor practitioner. I'd much rather be inside in the home corner, doing dolls dress up stuff. So it's a stereotype that we really need to challenge and think about more men of all kinds. We can then sort of expand our analysis to more Black men of all kinds, more Black queer men of all kinds, more disabled men of all kinds. Not just one white man that we need to come into the early years to save the profession. And I often have to caveat my argument that when I say for more men in early years, this is not to say that women are doing a bad job or that men will do necessarily any better. I think that the profession is doing an existing job of challenging gender stereotypes really well, but I do think a diversity of the profession will ultimately be useful for the child in challenging that model of representation and diversity of stereotypes.
We need a complete revolution, don't we?
Yeah, a little bit.
With empathy at the heart of it. I mean, it's and also more pay and more value. Oh dear, we've got to the end again. I never believe this. That we've managed to get through the whole hour. Actually, the whole thing has just raised so many questions of where we go next and how we can possibly, without the understanding on behalf of politicians of the significance of the sector, it's very, very difficult to see how we can make sure that that all the sorts of things you've been talking about today come into effect. So I suppose there's still plenty more work to be done. Thank you to both very, very much again. I know some people, I did spot it, thank goodness, pointed out in the chat. If you did buy the first edition of Play Is the Way, which does not feature Shadows chapter, you can download it. If you go on the Upstart website into the Play Is the Way section, it gives you the link to download it from there. And in fact, tell other people to download it too. Going out for free, it's always a good thing. And hopefully we'll be back soon with another book group, but we're at the moment preparing for our AGM, so I think we've still got 2 more chapters to cover, and very much looking forward to doing both of those. Thank you everybody again. Thank you everybody for coming along, and good night. Thank you.